Hello, all. We are in week 5 now, and our first lecture is going to be on Brown versus the Board of Education. I'm also going to talk about some of the more famous cases of schools that were segregated. I'm sorry, apologies, integrated by that legal case. Um, so in week 3, we discussed Plessy versus Ferguson, which ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. And this week, we're going to look at the ruling that overturns that, which is Brown versus the Board of Education. And Brown states something very important, which is that separate is inherently unequal. Um, so, Brown versus the Board of Education was ruled in 1954. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Um, Oliver Brown sued Topeka, Kansas Board of Education, and they had attempted to register Linda Brown, who was a third grader at the time, in an all-white school that was only 4 blocks from their house, as opposed to the all-African American school, which was 21 blocks from their house. Um, he said that segregation kept African American children from benefiting from equal protection under the law, which was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Um, the argument was that schools were not equal and never could be. And it's actually interesting and important that in Oliver Brown's case, they were more equal than they were in some areas. Topeka was not one of the worst areas um, in terms of African American schools. Many schools, especially in the South, were much worse. Um, and what they did was they actually considered 5 different cases as a part of the Brown versus Board of Education. So it's called Brown because it's based on the case of Oliver Brown and his daughter Linda. But the reality was there were multiple cases that are kind of lumped together to be considered as a whole. Thurgood Marshall, who I'm sure many of you know will go on to be a Supreme Court Justice, is chief counsel. Part of the argument for Brown versus the Board of Education was that separating students by race caused feelings of inferiority beyond whether they were receiving the same educational experience. The psychological and sociological argument was that merely just the act of separating them by race was causing harm to African American children. And they actually looked at studies of African American girls. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with some of the more famous aspects of it, which were things like they were more likely to choose white dolls over African American dolls, and how damaging it was to their self-esteem. It was a unanimous decision, which you know is a pretty unique idea. The opinion of the court was written by Chief Justice Earl Warren. In the field of public education, the doctrine separate but equal has no place. And he went on to say because separate is inherently unequal. So in the corner of my slide here, I have this is Linda Brown, and this is another a child that was in the case, and this is the legal defense team. So from the beginning, President Eisenhower actually opposed the decision, both privately and in public. He refused to either discuss or support the decision. People have said that he went and he wanted them to postpone it to the next administration to deal with. People have also said that he even spoke to the Chief Justice and said, let the states, let them handle desegregation. But if we're looking at an amendment violation, it's no longer just a states' right issue. So the 1954 case established that separate was inherently unequal, but it doesn't give any time frame for when integration or desegregation is supposed to happen. So in 1955, they discussed it again, and that's usually called Brown 2. And unfortunately, they remain rather ambiguous. And what it says is with all deliberate speed. And as you can imagine, that gives no real time frame. It doesn't set specific parameters. So there was a lot of rebelling and disagreement in the South, and they were not ready to go along with that. So there was lots of opposition. Um, and I just want to point out that this is the rest of the children that were a part of the case. Um, Alabama attempted to nullify the Supreme Court decision. Um, Virginia insisted the state had a right to interpose its sovereignty against the Supreme Court's ruling. Um, there were citizens' councils, which basically became a more middle class version of citizens of the KKK. A little less violent, but violence and intimidation was a part of it. Um, by the time we're done, it has 250,000 members in citizen councils, and those are just the ones we know about. So it becomes a pretty powerful force in the South to keep schools from integrating. In 1958, So in Cooper versus Aaron, in 1958, what they did was the Little Rock Nine, which I'm going to be talking about in just a minute, had had tried to integrate the school, and people were contesting that it was turmoil and that there were problems and this, that, and the other, and states shouldn't have to do this. And basically what the Supreme Court rules is that African American constitutional rights cannot be put off because of turmoil. So I think that's important, that they're saying that constitutional rights are something that are important. We can't just ignore that because there's conflict over it. Also, they they reaffirmed the Supreme Court decision and the right to make that decision, and they basically said the decision stands, that they were right, that Brown versus Board of Education is correct, and they said that states are mandated to fulfill that decision. So now I'm just going to overview some of the more major integration. And I do want to note that some schools did integrate with little or no problems. Some schools did not protest. Some schools integrated quietly. This is not all schools, but there were a lot of them, and there was a lot of racial violence at the time, and it's important for us to understand that. Okay, and the first one is going to be Autherine Lucy. She, along with Polly Ann Myers, who unfortunately was not allowed to finish the process, they attempted to integrate the University of Alabama in 1955 to 1956. Polly Ann Myers was originally going to attend with Autherine Lucy, but unfortunately they basically came up with a trumped-up charge and did not allow her to attend. So Miss Lucy had to go on her own for the University of Alabama, and her time there was very short-lived. First, they sent her home and barred her because they could not protect her safety, and then they claimed that she had made accusations at school that they did not protect her. And it seems very silly because they did not protect her. You know that there was violent rioting, and she did not necessarily feel safe. An interesting thing that always strikes me is in 1982 she actually obtained her master's from the University of Alabama. So it's nice to know that she came full circle and obtained that degree. But she was actually expelled from the school and not able to attend. So then one of the more famous cases is the Little Rock Nine. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with them. In 1957, between Brown versus the Board of Education and the pressure from the local chapter of the NAACP, the school board did actually come up with a plan for gradual integration. So, to some degree, they participated in trying to do a positive thing. So then Governor Orville Faubus, he called out the National Guard and actually had the National Guard waiting at the school to stop them from attending. Um, President Eisenhower finally takes a step during this period, even though he doesn't necessarily agree with the desegregation of schools. He does understand that a state military is being used to stop the Supreme Court from enacting its will, and that's important because I think for Eisenhower in the end, it's a federal state issue. Um, so what he does is he nationalizes and takes control of the National Guard. He shifts them to the federal government. He orders the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to enforce the 14th Amendment in the Supreme Court decision. And as I said again, I don't think he is necessarily in favor of integration as much as he understands that this is now a federal issue and it needs to be dealt with. In 1958, Faubus closes the schools rather than integrate them, and the schools will not reopen again until 1959. And most of the Little Rock Nine will eventually graduate from Little Rock High School. So another interesting case is Prince Edward County, Virginia. In 1959, they chose to close their entire school district rather than integrate it. Um, Virginia um, had integrated a lot of their schools, and they were basically being forced to integrate. And what happened is they closed their schools, and what they did was they set up private schools for white students, so that white students would not miss out on their education. However, African Americans had no schools to attend until 1964. So it's 5 years that they had no public school system. I mean, there were some options. Some people went and educated their kids with family friends. Some people went out of state. The Society of Friends or the Quakers also assisted. Um, but basically, many African American children missed out on their educational opportunity for 5 years in Prince Edward County because they refused to integrate. So another case of school integration is Ruby Bridges. This happened in 1960 in New Orleans. Um, there were 6 children put up to go to this all-white school, and they went through psychological and educational testing. And Ruby Bridges was the only one who passed those tests. She was only 6 years old when she was attending the all-white school. She was escorted by federal marshals. I have a picture here of the first day of protests. And I think Ruby Bridges is a great story of the beauty of childhood because she's often noted as saying that at first when she got there, she thought it was a Mardi Gras celebration. She had no idea that they were there to protest her attending school with white children. And actually, no white children would attend class with her. The picture down here shows her and her teacher the first year. And it was just her and the teacher, the one teacher that would take her. And they basically held class all alone. Her picture becomes really famous. Norman Rockwell, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, did this painting. And he called it the problem we all live with. And I think that the image of this young girl being walked by federal marshals to her school was really striking to him, and not only him, but to many people during this period. Um, you know, During that year, her father lost his job. Her mother was banned from a grocery store. and her grandparents were evicted from their sharecropping home, all because Ruby Bridges attended an all-white school. So the last one I'm going to briefly discuss, and like I said, this is not to say these are the only cases. I just wanted to kind of give you, my goal was to give you an idea of the time period, to make you understand that after Brown, it's not an immediate integration of schools, and that this continues to go on for a very long time, up and through the 70s. So our last case is going to be in 1962 with James Meredith, who wanted to attend the University of Mississippi. Um, he had served 9 years in the Air Force and then had gone to a community college to get a 2-year degree. And he was turned down several times for the University of Mississippi. He petitioned the government and basically said, the only reason I'm getting rejected is because of my race. And eventually he was accepted, and Robert Kennedy sent federal marshals to protect him. And President John F. Kennedy also sent some military support. Because in a way, James Meredith really called them out. John Kennedy had gotten elected promising to help African Americans win their civil rights and during the civil rights movement, and really his support had been very limited. Um, so, so they called out, the federal marshals were sent to protect him. In the end, because of the rioting and issues, 60 marshals were wounded, 28 by gunshot, and 2 bystanders were killed. Um, it was an extremely volatile time, and you can see this is, I mean, 8 years after the original Brown decision, and we were still fighting to get schools integrated, and experiencing really strong resistance. So he eventually graduates in 1964 and actually goes on to continue to advocate for civil rights. Um, so to wrap up in conclusion, Brown versus the Board of Education overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, ruling that separate is inherently unequal. And this is important not just for schools, but it really sets up integration and desegregation in all areas of American life. It kind of sets up the ruling that can continue to strike down segregation in other areas. Um, One thing that I think is important, we're going to talk about civil rights and the civil rights movement a lot for the next few weeks. I had to pick how to break it down, so hopefully you guys will appreciate the way I've chosen to divide it up. We're going to bounce back and forth time-wise a little bit. But I think it's important to note that Brown versus Board of Education is the legal decision that says, yes, these people have a right to be where they are. They have a right from the federal government to equal protection under the law. But the reality is it's enforced by grassroots movements. It's enforced by people choosing to send often their little kids into volatile, violent situations. Ruby Bridges had to seek counseling when she was young. She dealt with a lot of hate and anger. And not only her, but others, the Little Rock Nine, all the groups I talked about, they're very young people. And they had to deal with a lot of people. So one of the women in the Little Rock Nine talked about she didn't understand how a group of people could hate her so much when they didn't even know her. I think that that's really striking. These are legal decisions we're going to talk about, but it's really the people who have to enforce their own civil rights. They have to keep pushing for the federal government to get involved, and there is minimal, limited federal support for these civil rights movements. And in fact, often they find opposition in the federal government, and definitely opposition in the local and state governments. So I think that that's an important part of the civil rights I think people are often decrying where are our leaders today, but what's important to understand about the civil rights movement, there were important great leaders, but really it was the power of the people. Um, and the last thing I want to notice, like I noted at the beginning of my overview of the schools, is that some schools integrated peacefully and with little issue, that some schools accepted it. Um, Not all of them. Many of them took the tactic of Virginia and closed down. Schools in Mississippi did that. Civil rights workers will talk about this as a very important moment for them. So, you know, it's a diversity of experience. So my reference slide is huge this week, as I'm sure you're going to see. Now, as we move on, these are more and more decades you may choose to do for your final paper. Um, Please be sure to check out any of these resources. They're where I got my pictures, where I've gotten some of the information and the quotes that I use in my lectures. Um, so you'll see, one other thing that I just wanted to point out this week is that you'll notice that the reference for my Word documents and my PowerPoint is often different, and that's because I just have to pull in more references in order to get pictures and visual things for you guys to look at, because hopefully you enjoy those visual points as much as I do. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.